too much of a cheerleader. I have to really pull out. I'm trying not to be sold on it, right? And I know you guys want to sell me, right? Because there's nobody else. And I swear to God, anybody's got sold. As quick as your eyes will work. No, this is for city council. This is what we're going to talk about. No, I don't. I want to talk to you about your experience running for office. I'm in a fact-finding mode. And I you know I have a hard time hearing you, right?
I had a mental breakdown and had severe anxiety and had to go back on medication.
Okay, well, can you still talk to me about it after this?
Yeah, for like 10 minutes, because I got to free my mom.
Okay.
I have to let her be free.
Give me time. Is a phone call more convenient for you?
What hours are the phones?
I can give you 10 minutes if you don't cover everything that
Give me time.
I will call.
Give me time. Yeah? Okay. I'll try not to make it extra traumatic for you by the stuff. I just want to, I want to go into this thing and choose to go into it with eyes
But you know what we're going to talk about.
Huh?
You know what we're going to talk about. Check.
Well, they wouldn't do that in Hastings. Oh, they did do
it. Check. Check. Okay. And it was good? Okay. Check. Good evening, everybody. How are you tonight? Thank you for coming out. It's going to get colder, so just in case you were feeling bad about this, it's just prepare yourself. This is just a taste of what's to come. So welcome to Voices in the Valley. I'm Shelley Tugis. I'm the director of the Hudson Library, and I'm thrilled that we have Ministerial Voices tonight. This has been a fantastic series. We've got great feedback on our attempt to sort of share perspectives and the different people and lifestyles and jobs and all the unique elements of our community are able to sort of come here and share their stories and perspectives. I do want to thank people who have helped make this series possible. Addison Filiatro has been phenomenal. Yes, Hop and Barrel. River Channel, thank you, Jeff, for your help. And the Hudson Area Library Foundation. So tonight, we have 3 ministers from our area. Kendra Grams, she's with the First Presbyterian Church of Hudson. Larry Seisman with Faith Community Church. And Michelle Arndt, the Crossing Covenant Church, which is in Holton. So I'm going to let each of you do your own introduction about yourself and your church, and please share your story of your path to the ministry. And Kendra, maybe we'll just start with you.
Yes, so Kendra Grams again from First Presbyterian Church here in Hudson. Wonderful intergenerational church. Try to be very welcoming of all. And it's good to be with you all, and thanks to the library and Hop and Barrel too, again. So the short version of how I got into ministry, At a fairly young age, I grew up in the church, in a Presbyterian church, actually in south central Nebraska. And at a fairly young age, started to feel nudges that, oh, maybe this is something. But like a lot of my colleagues that I know was like, let's make sure. So I actually studied biology and infectious diseases in college. And when I discovered what practically would be involved, I realized that wasn't for me. If you know that field, micropipetting wasn't my thing. So I tell people that I remember the Howard Thurman quote, and I'm going to read it here so I get it right. Ask yourself what makes you come alive and go and do that, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And I just realized after continuing to try ministry things and biology things that I much more came alive with my full person as a pastor. So that's the short version.
So I'm Larry Ziman, lived in Hudson for 30 years, proudly call Hudson home, and I'm really, really grateful to be here. I'm part of Faith Community, a church that's been around about 38 years, I think, roughly. Started at the La Petite Salon at the Hudson House, moved to what's currently known as Cornerstone Church by Willow River Elementary, and we've been on Carmichael Road for a while. How I got a sense of direction ministry. So I was a fairly church kid. God was off and on again, meaningful, not meaningful to me, but my sophomore year of college, while I was experiencing a fair amount of disorientation about who I was and all sorts of things, seemed like my wheels fell off. I started pursuing God most personally through Jesus and found a radical reorientation of my heart, primarily towards other people, and I moved, I would say, from increased selfishness to more caring and helping of others. And as a result, I was getting more and more on the giving end of the equation, found myself coming alive in the process and people affirming that. And as I went through college, I was hearing more and more of that. Decided to go on to seminary. Well, I served 3 years part-time in a church after getting a sense of, okay, this is who I am, what I want to be. Went to grad school for a few years, and I've been here for 30 years now, and really grateful. So, like Kendra, this is a very short version. Unlike Kendra, I don't know microbiology. Sounds scary.
My name is Michelle Arndt, and my husband and I have lived in Hudson for 20 years, but we've been a part of the community for close to 25 years. So some overlap to Kendra and Larry's stories. Just, I think often for those that find themselves in ministry or in pastoring, there's generally something at a young age that at least sparks, and then you kind of put it away and go, I don't know what that was. But I would say that, from the time I was young, I really wanted to figure God out. And like Larry, I had fits and starts, and I joke about, all my summers at summer camp and youth retreats growing up, and, I'm trying to figure out what it meant to give my life to Jesus. And I don't think I really actually figured that out until probably my early 20s, and right after my husband and I got married, some pretty big stuff went down that first year in our marriage that confronted a lot of my inner understanding of who I thought I was and who I thought Jesus was, and I had to answer the question in a better and deeper way than just, I'm a sinner and I can go to heaven if I say yes to Jesus. It confronted a lot of my fears and my pride, and it reoriented, I like that word, my insides towards a life that was more about Jesus than myself. Larry's had a big role in that because we were a part of Faith Community Church for a very, very long time. During that time, served in a lot of different capacities with youth, worship ministry, and women's ministry. Also in 2009, I left my corporate job. I actually went to school for broadcast journalism. So I interned at KSTP in the Twin Cities. I have demo tapes that are absolutely no good because there's not even a high A player to play them on anymore. However, I would say the carryover is I have always loved hearing people's stories and learning to tell good stories. And a lot of what pastoring is those two things. And so during the years that our family was at Faith, Larry had a big role in helping shape me as a person. And I also, in 2009, left my job in the corporate world and which I never did go into broadcasting all the way. That's a whole other story. Ended up in collegiate ministry with college students at UW River Falls. And so that was for me where that spark from early childhood went, oh, now I see how this works. And all of a sudden, that all of those passions and gifts had a place. And then that kind of birthed and awakened this path to plant a new church here in Hudson. So our church is not even 3 years old yet. And so I left the college scene a few years ago to start the crossing. So that is, man, short stories. You got pastors up here. You think this is going to go an hour? We use an hour each on Sundays, right? Okay. We're going to try. We're going to try.
Well, a little planning joke. We normally have 4 speakers, but made a decision for 3. We were thinking. Thank you for that. I do want to just give you a heads up. If you haven't been here for this series, occasionally one of the video games will screech at us. Just ignore that. And then occasionally it will brew next to you. And that lasts about 30 seconds, so you can just wait it out because it is going to be very loud when it happens. So, okay. Pew survey. A recent Pew survey had some interesting data. There it is. This is what's giving us beer tomorrow, so no complaints. There we go. Interesting data. So a Pew survey showed that Americans' memberships in houses of worship declined significantly from 73% back in the 1930s to about 47% in 2020. So I'm curious if those numbers are reflected locally and your views on what appears to be a significant trend. And we'll start with you this time, Larry.
So I'm very aware of the national numbers and what's happening generally, especially intergenerationally, is where we see, I think, the most significant shift in numbers. I would say our experience of Faith Community is that we continue to experience moderate growth in the last 2 years, and so we're grateful for that. I think it says a few things, one of which is there's a lot less cultural cachet in being a church-going person than there was 30, 40 years ago. If you showed up to town and started an insurance agency 40 years ago and you weren't part of the church, people would give you one of the, the hairy eye type thing. And so one of the things that I'm seeing is that is our culture is becoming more secular, is that's not as highly valued by the culture as large. And so for those who would be, what I would say, have a tendency to be merely religious, there's not the upside in it. And so I think one of my assessments is that we're seeing people where their faith is more central. We see that continuing, but those where it's more peripheral, they're kind of fading off. And so while I find it disconcerting in some ways, it's not necessarily intimidating. And we are seeing some better things overall in Hudson. So.
Yeah, I think just to tug on the thread that Larry already offered, I think that we are in a different age of the world in the church, and I think even to speak more specifically to Western Christianity, I think that the book that came to mind, so there's a pastor over in the cities who I really enjoy and have followed for a long time. His name is Greg Boyd, and he wrote a book years ago that really rattled people's bones called The Myth of a Christian Nation. And basically what he was beginning to do was to say, for a long time we've assumed that to be American is to be Christian is to be American, and the two are the same thing. And I think in the last 40 years, kind of what Larry was laying out is we're seeing that those two things are two very different things, and where people are trying to keep them together, that's where there's an incredible amount of conflict and confusion, because to say, I think to be an American carries one set of allegiances and freedoms, and the way Jesus talks about allegiance and freedom is completely the opposite of how our nation talks about it. So gone are the days of American Christendom when everybody down the street goes to church like a good little Christian. I think there's been a little bit more of a parsing so that to be Christian in name just doesn't work anymore. And so those that are still trying to hold on to that, I think that's where we're seeing a lot of this confusing messaging, where it's like, well, wait, that person says it's this and this and this and this. And so I think there's a sifting that's happened. Those that are finding their ways to churches today, I think are there because they're asking deeper questions, and they don't want to marry their faith to their citizenship. And so I think that that's a good way to start making sense of what we see happening in the church. So I'm actually maybe a little encouraged that we're seeing some people fall out the doors of the church, in the sense that it forces us to say, are we following Jesus or are we following the country? Like, those are not the same thing.
Yeah, so I'm relatively new to the community. Been here a little over 3.5 years now, so it's a little harder for me to say if that's a trend that's been reflected locally, but like Larry, certainly know about national trends. And just building off a little bit of this thread too, of people really wanting to be there who are there. As a parent of young children and a relatively younger person in the church, relatively younger, yes, I didn't throw you totally under the bus over there. One thing, like, people ask me, like, why, because I have many people my age who are like, why? They just do not get it. And for me, what is so central about it is seeking a community that makes me better and builds relationships that will help see me through. I mean, I saw that growing up in a church community that was very devoted to welcome and nurture and intergenerational connection. And that is something I deeply want for my children and for all people, because I think if we're following this ethic of love that is central to what Jesus teaches, that embodies community in a way that we all need it. Community that challenges us to be our best selves, the goodness in which we were created, and also carries us when it gets really hard, right? Because we know there's always these times where we face challenge, whatever it is. We're all continuing to undergo trauma via pandemic, right? So it's just been really encouraging, even for me, to see my own community, First Presbyterian, hang in there, right? We're like a little bit in person and a lot on Zoom, and then sometimes more in person and a little bit on Zoom. But people have hung with us, and I think that goes to the people who are there, want to be there and want to grow together, and that's and want to share God's love. So I find that encouraging, even though statistics are what they are. They'll always be what they are, but I think God calls us to something deeper.
So we have some great questions coming in from the audience and viewers. So I will go to those, but I think it would be helpful first to just understand your job a little bit more, because we all know about Sunday. We know what you do on Sunday. And I have the pleasure of serving on a board with Larry, so I know you do something else too. But I think that would be really helpful to know, how do you spend your week? And I'm sure the hours are long and require great flexibility. So I think we're back to Michelle.
Thanks. Yeah, I was actually on the phone with somebody this morning that made that joke, like, well, because we know you're done working for the week because you worked yesterday morning. And I was like, that's funny. That's very funny. I'm in a panel tonight where that's one of the questions. So my week is structured in a few different spaces. One of the places that I really try to invest a lot of my time is developing the leaders at our church. So each church has its own leadership structure, whether it's elders or leaders or whomever are the other people, the key people that are serving. Ideally, I would think a church is hopefully not being run only by its pastor. And so for me, developing my leaders is one of my top priorities because they're kind of my boots on the ground people. They're the people that I want everyone else in the church to see as like, Michelle's not the only one with the answers. And so, leadership team meetings are 2 to 3 hours at least once a month. There's a lot of prep that goes into those meetings so that we can use our time thoughtfully. And then I'm doing one-on-ones with most of our leaders. So our team is 4. That includes me with each of them once a month. Had one this morning, had one last Friday morning. So that's a spot I spend a lot of time, meetings with other pastors. I get to see these two and some of the other pastors around town, usually at least once a week. The denomination I'm a part of has some pastoral groups that I attend, usually once a month. I spend time, my husband and I have had the opportunity to mentor some young married couples in our church. So that's a place, especially those that are getting ready to get married. We meet with them over the course of the 6 months coming up to their wedding. So that's another space. Short and long range planning for teaching. Whether that's Sunday morning message sermon based or classes or non-Sunday learning spaces. Those take time. A lot of reading, communal engagement, looking for places like this or other spaces to engage. And then I would say technology and social media takes up a lot of time these days as a pastor, especially for me because I'm the only pastor at our church because we're new and small. So a lot of those admin pieces fall to me. And so I spend a good amount of time doing that. And then I'm also finishing my Master's of Divinity right now. I've got about 4 classes left. So somewhere in all of that, I squeeze classes in and do homework. So that's a little bit of how I do my week.
Yeah, I would ditto a lot of that. One thing that Michelle maybe didn't mention, also that I end up doing a lot of, and this I think varies by the demographics of our congregations. My congregation has a significant older population, so I do actually do a lot of pastoral visits. Thankfully back to visiting in person with precautions, which has been great. There was a lot of phone calls for a long, long time. I mean, there's still lots of phone calls. But a lot of that. And the other thing I would just say is it not only varies by the week, it varies by the season, and it's a lot of both and. Particularly in this season, I joke, like sometimes in late November or early December, people will come and be like, you know what we should do for Christmas? And I'm like, that's a really great idea. Let's hold that for next year because we planned out Christmas a couple months ago. So it's kind of a that always a forward planning, but also living and responding in the moment and helping walk with people where they are because life happens. And so there's always that adaptability that's needed.
So my setting's a bit different. I'm one of 5 pastors at Faith Community with a staff, I think, of 16. And so I have very little, virtually no upfront Sunday morning expectations. Number of areas I cover. So one is front-end hospitality and onboarding. So it's our ambition that anyone God brings our way would feel welcome, noticed, and loved. And I work with a team of volunteers every week that we hope to see that take place so that we can help them take their next steps in their faith journey. Another area that I deal with is external relations. I'm currently engaged with a number of people. We're training pastors in Uganda. I was there in September and November. I'll be going back January 4th, God willing. Visa's working. And so that's another aspect of what I do. I also do crisis care. So when something really hits the fan in some people's life, I'm the one who tends to go there, deal with that. That extends also, I serve as a chaplain with the St. Croix County Sheriff's Office and first responders throughout the county. So many Wednesday afternoons you'll see me in a police car with Hudson or St. Croix County Sheriff, River Falls, or so I wear very different hats than many others here. And so I tend to live a lot an on-call life in some ways, but what I've found is that one of my greatest joys is external relationships. I'm given a lot of latitude to engage the community, and which is why I'm here, which is why I know these two, and which is why I love my job.
Thank you. I'm going to go to this question first, and it's sort of a two-part question, so I'm going to focus on the COVID part for now. Tell us a little bit about the impact of COVID on your congregations and the way you work and engage. But also, do you feel ministers have an obligation to try to combat dis and misinformation about COVID issues, whether we're talking about masks, vaccines, politics, policies, all very easy stuff to weigh in on. So, you can start, Kendra.
Yes. So COVID threw everybody for a loop, right? I think very early on, our congregation and our leadership, to their deep credit, just dove all in on being guided by the value and ethic that we read in Scripture, that is, Jesus calls us to protect the most vulnerable. And so early on, when it was clear that this is like the worst for the elderly and we don't know anything, actually early on, the decisions were almost the easiest. Though I lost a ton of sleep that week in March, that was the easiest. Okay, we're going full virtual. And then from there, as things progressed, there's no one right answer, right? Once vaccines were available, and my congregation has been great, a very high vaccine uptake, and it was great to work with some of them. Not all of them navigate technology, and so we had some great volunteers who were willing to help schedule appointments and all kinds of things, so that was great to see. But as time has moved along, it's been harder and harder to say who is the most vulnerable, right? Is it still the elderly? Is it now the children who can't be unvaccinated? Is it the immunocompromised? Is it the people who are super isolated and haven't had human contact for a really long time? Is it our healthcare providers who continue to be overtaxed, right? There's no one right answer. And so it's been this journey to constantly ask those questions and try to be faithful, and my congregation has been great to be right there with us with masking and distancing, and yep, we're doing things way different, and I don't love it all, but we do it in the sake of caring for one another in our community, and not being a place where hopefully we'll spread something that might hurt somebody else, but also honoring people's need for connection and community. As far as disinformation, yes, I do think clergy, as community leaders, absolutely have a responsibility to share information carefully and to share reliable information. And so I've certainly tried to do that. I will never claim I do anything perfectly. That is just not true, but encouraging people and linking people to the best information from our public health officials, and helping answer their question, and being a good listener when they have questions and helping them find the information they need, I think, is a critical role we can play.
Yeah, COVID has really rocked our world. Like Kendra said, that it was so easy when the state had a mandate, because our job is to submit to the government unless they're asking us to do something immoral. So that made it really easy. The question is, as that was lifted, and what do you do then? And then I was part of the Hudson Area Corona Task Force. And I still, actually today I didn't, but virtually every day I go to the county website, I check the numbers, look at the trends, what's going on. And I actually threw a party in July for the end of our task force because we were averaging 1 case a day at that time. And we thought we were out of the woods. It was glorious. And then the woods came back with a vengeance. In our approach, we have a service, we have people, we have masked area, people are masked with wide gaps in their rows. And then we have, there's still, the seating's more, the rows are further apart than they used to be, but unmasked. And a good portion of our people do go unmasked. It's hard to know who gets what, when, where, to be honest. I would say that in the first wave, about a year ago, I knew one man moderately well who died, knew a handful of people got sick. I know all sorts of people now who are sick. Lots of people. And so the dance continues. And I think one of the biggest challenges we face is how do we live in community, talking to each other, loving each other, challenging one another, and not turning everything into a hissy fit. And that's just one of the really difficult parts of this dance. I myself, vaccinated, boosted, in part because I do international travel and I like to hang out with cops. And then there's health, the regular health stuff. And so what do we do with misinformation? It's hard because people look at the same numbers and come to different conclusions. I mean, it's just really, really stunning. I usually, in my role, because I'm not upfront on Sundays, my usually is helping people process, appeal to facts, to interact. I regularly have access to doctors in the area who are helpful with the county. I often consult my own physician regularly and keep a line open there to ask all sorts of questions, and have just been blown away, totally blown away by their availability, their honesty. They're willing to dumb down so I can understand things in a really gracious manner, and just been really blown away by the healthcare workers through this whole process. They are deserving a lot of praise.
I'll try to comment quickly because I think Kendra and Larry covered a lot of it. I mean, again, as a small congregation, when COVID hit, it was like, well, we don't have a lot to lose because we didn't have a lot to start with. So, I mean, there was that. The challenge for us was we didn't have a building. We didn't have a ton of technology. We were literally filming Sunday morning worship in our living room with my family, 2 of whom our kids are both relatively musical. So we just made it up. It was sort of like the Von Trapps meets the, what's the 70s show with Susan Day that I'm thinking of? The Partridge Family. It was that. That was pretty much that.
Why would I know the 70s?
I don't know, Larry. Why would you know the 70s? So we just kind of rolled with it. And yeah, I think the longer we've gotten into the pandemic, obviously, I think the harder it is for us to give firm directives to people based on what our own values are, because people are still going to say, well, this is what I think and this is what I think. As far as, I think, disinformation, I would hope not only with regards to COVID, but I think one of the things we're asked to steward as pastors is to help people learn how to think. I think for many years, like it's, we're supposed to teach the truth, and people even define that differently. But I think for me, teaching people how to think is more important than teaching them what to think. So if I can teach you how to think and say, now hold on a minute, is that a good news source? Or do we know that that was an accurate news source? Or, like whatever that might be. I think for me, I would rather teach people how to think than what to think. And then model what the right answer is in hopes that they put 2 and 2 together. Because you're not gonna, we all know we can't enforce as pastors. So I think it's been a tricky game.
Okay, I'm going to try to tie a couple of things together here. We've had a lot of public conversation, dialogue in our community about differences and tolerance and inclusivity. So The question is, would you support an ecumenical letter to the city and county in favor of inclusivity and tolerance of all people? And let's tie into that dealing with phobia that you see in your church, whether we're talking about racism or transphobia, gay phobia, just general intolerance, and how you handle that when you interact with people and from the pulpit. And Larry, I think you get to go first on this one.
I was hoping I was fifth in this one. I need to read. So the first question is, would it support an ecumenical? Yeah. So the first question I'd have is, what do you mean by ecumenical? So we are part of an organization called HAMA, the Hudson Area Ministerial Association, which affirms our unity in Christ, that we're a collegial and collaborative working, seeking the welfare of the St. Croix Valley. Okay, so that's what HAMA is about. And so we have done letters with HAMA, and they've been received mixed by the public and by churches. And I would suspect if we did that again, it would be the same experience. One of the things that characterizes our tribe is that we work pretty hard on not seeking to bind the conscience of other people. And so we tend to be slow to make, for lack of a better term, decrees, except for those things which we believe that we would all tend to believe. I believe in one God, the Father, Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, that type of thing. We find that there are things that we would die for. They're small. Things that we would defend, right? They're more. And then there are things we would discuss, which is a lot broader, sort of categories. Part of the challenge in these types of challenges in a world that we live in today, we can use the same words, and a number of people think of them very differently. Inclusivity. All right, what does that mean? I can tell you that as a follower of Jesus, God commands me to treat every breathing human being with dignity because they're an image bearer. As they bear the image of God, whether they share the same orientation as me or not, doesn't matter. As an image bearer, they are given that right because they've been endowed by God as an image bearer. And you can go on and on about almost every word that was in that question. And so the tendency to make broad declarations tend not to be helpful, and they can often further create the tribalism that's so much of a challenge of where we live right now. And so I would be personally hesitant. I would, in smaller settings, be all about a discussion. But as far as decrees, my take is that the decrees that tend to be going out these days tend not to bind hearts together. And that tends to be where I want to fight that fight. I want to speak the truth in love, as the Apostle Paul says. And there's a tendency for some to be truth, 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 and all love, love, love. And the call for the follower of Jesus is balancing both. Some days I actually kind of come close. Some days I fail miserably. So.
Yeah, I would start with something Larry laid out, which is just that terms, again, get ambiguous. And so we would, if we all took a vocabulary test here tonight and we put terms like truth and inclusivity and all these things, I bet our definitions would have quite a bit of variety. So that's part of what makes this challenging. But I think to underscore what Larry said, if the question is, are we to welcome one another as we want to be welcomed? That just should not be a hard question. That just should not be a hard question, but unfortunately it is because of phobia and fear. And I think where I thought about this, you had a question you had sent us before we got here tonight, Shelley, that kind of fell in this same area. I think that for a long time, for whatever reason, those of the Christian faith have tended to view other people groups as groups to be conquered and converted. I mean, just do a little church history. I'm taking church history 3 in spring just to round it out and make sure I hit it all. But I think when we look at our history and we get honest about it, Christianity, all of the denominations, so we're not going to throw anyone under the bus. Everyone has had a turn being the bully on the playground throughout church history, okay? So it wasn't that group and that group and that group. But there tends to be, I think, this mindset for Christians that other people groups are like, oh, they're not Christians. We got to get them and fix them and convert them. Instead of saying, you and I have the same breath in our lungs, therefore, what can I listen and learn from you? That's a way better model to me. So it's, I guess what I'm saying is posture towards one another is more important to me than policy over one another. Posture towards one another is more important to me than policy. Like, we're not gonna legislate people to love one another well. Like, Jesus knew that. So, I think for me, inclusivity is about extending gracious welcome with no reservations of any kind.
Yeah. So I think, as Larry and Michelle shared, you see, we all talk about these things very differently. And so anytime we get into ecumenical statements, there's a reason there's a whole bunch of Christian denominations in the world, right? Because we all talk about these, and we've all gotten mad at each other at some point and said, I can't be on board with that or this or that or that. So I think locally we try to find the common ground where we can and know that there are differences. And I totally agree. We have to, come with a good posture of love. I also, knowing that, as we all do, the history of the church, part of the bedrock of my faith too, in my reading of Scripture, is that Jesus didn't just desire wholeness and salvation in some far-off place that we like to call heaven, right? Jesus was about wholeness and community and love here and now. And so one of the bedrock things for me is that welcome and proclaiming that wholeness, and the image bearer terminology that Larry brought up, that all of humanity is made in the image of God or bears the image of God somehow. One of the ways I talk about that is everybody was created good in great diversity, right? Of all races and gender identities and sexual orientations and all the things, right? God created this beautiful diversity. I believe that fully. And part of then wholeness is honoring that and welcoming that. And so we all talk about it differently. So those shared statements are always a challenge, but we do try to find those nuggets where we can step out together and say, we all agree X is wrong, or we all agree this is what we need to do. But as Larry said, sometimes we're slow because we have a lot of diversity among us.
So I'm turning on the blender and trying to combine some of these topics and issues. And I'd found this really great column from an Australian pastor who was visiting the U.S. and was watching our news shows. And I sent out like a 400-word quote from that column, and we had some discussion. And I'm just going to get to the heart of it because I think we agreed this was the core part. So this visiting pastor wrote, watching these TV shows, it was a surreal experience, like simultaneously living in two alternate realities and seeing how Christianity was being weaponized by both the right and the left of American politics. And it touches on one of our viewers' questions here about national and state politics and how divisive everything has become. And we're actually seeing that trickle down into local races as well and local issues. So as somebody who has a big audience, how do you talk about that behavior and politics in general? But specifically, it feels to me like a lot worse because of social media, and maybe I'm just getting older and more sensitive, but I think we agree it certainly isn't helping. So that is a very broad question about behavior, politics, and what you do about it in your role.
Larry was going to pass the buck anyways. Like, I got the hard one last time. Make her try it. Okay. So I think for me, one of the learning curves of stepping from college ministry into the adult sector is, well, first of all, being on a public campus, you've got a lot more range to have conversation. It's interesting to me that in the church, we suddenly have a whole segment of things we're not supposed to talk about. Since when have secrets in the church ever been a good idea? Anyway, I would say this, Jesus, when I think of Jesus, how he handled tough issues in his day, he was political. He was political, but he was not partisan. And I think that's the part that we have to continue to cling to. So Jesus had liberal and conservative political parties in his day. He had Sadducees, Pharisees, and everything in between. And he didn't try to step inside one of the political parties to try to, get his message across. He tried to offer an alternate to. And so I think for me, I really have tried to say all of life is a politic. The word politic means a way of life. And so we can't ignore politics in the church because we are in the business of talking about a way of life. So I think the way to go about it is to kind of think how Jesus cast an imagination for a different ethic. So I think of, like, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus' first public sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, he was very clearly saying, I'm introducing a new power system and a new kingdom and a new way of viewing power and being. And so I think that is what I see my role as, is to say we can't ignore the issues, we can't hide them under the bed, but we're not going to talk about them in political parties because those are just far too narrow for Jesus. They're never going to work for us. And he invited us to a much broader lens through which to see the politic, the way of life. So, I don't want to go off on the actual specific issues because there are many of them, but again, how we're talking is more important.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with Michelle in that Jesus was absolutely about shaping community and changing power structures. He was executed because he was doing that. He was saying we need to change things around here, and people did not like it. So I remind people of that, and there's many examples. The other thing I would just say to build on what Michelle said is one of the things I talk about with my people is, faith. Our faith should guide all of what we do, including how we're active in the community. That doesn't mean we're imposing our faith on other people, but when we are interacting in the community, when we're interacting with elected officials, when we're considering who we think our elected officials should be, we should bring the lens of when I vote, I'm thinking, well, which one of these candidates is most seeking what I read Jesus to want us to seek, which is wholeness and community and enough for everybody, right? So not imposing my views on others, but encouraging everyone to bring the values that they learn from their faith into how they are interacting in the public sphere.
Turned to Michelle a few moments ago and said, I forgot the question. That's because, as my wife won't attest, I was listening so well to you, I forgot.
Do you need to repeat?
Yeah. Can you remind me?
How do you talk about politics?
Okay. Oh, no, no. I don't remember, so I'll pass it on here. No, one of the big things that both have alluded to is we try to create God in our image, rather than respond to trying to reflect the image of God. And Jesus had enough room that in his followers, his immediate followers, he had a tax collector who was a Roman occupying force employee, and a zealot whose job was to take out Roman employed, type workers. And the gospel was big enough to both include and change both of those postures, right? And what we see in Christ is one who says, whosoever will may come. He is not a distant, hands-off, push you out of the way type of deity. And he goes to the cross, he humbles himself to the point of death for anyone who'd respond to the gracious free gift that he offers. So how does that relate to politics? It means that we should be willing to listen and learn from anybody. Apostle Paul says we see through a glass dimly, right? That we do not see things as we should be, and as clearly as we ought or could. Never, ever. And so a posture of humility is really, really core in that. I'm convinced that both the left and the right, the main goal of much of their political job is to keep people in the queues behind them and not consider the people on the other side. I don't think that's an option Jesus gives. I'm supposed to love every neighbor. And so part of what I've been part of trying to help, I'm part of a Golden Rule initiative that's taking place here in Hudson. And I can tell you, when I got signs, one of the first things I did is I took signs to 5 people identified who I'm pretty convinced think differently than I do. And I talked to them and asked them if they'd consider. All 5 said yes. And part of my goal was to confuse people. Because there are people with the Golden Rule who are looking in signs that usually don't add up in this us-them world we live in. And I think that's a healthier representation of what God's up to. Right? Not that the Golden Rule team's got it all together, not by a long shot. But what we're trying to say is that this tribalism, if it doesn't stop, we're toast. We're toast. And I, for one, am going to live in the murky, mucky middle and take hits from both sides and hopefully live happily ever after. Oh, that's it, right?
I just want to say that when the storm blew apart the library, we lost a lot of things, blinds, books, paper, you can't even imagine. But our Golden Rule sign did not move. I love that. So let's just talk about our kids for a moment, because they are so important to us, and we could take this in all kinds of directions, but we know that youth today are really struggling. Depression is up, anxiety is up, suicidal behavior is way up. And I'm sort of wondering what you think your church's role is in youth development and how we as a community could be engaging in this issue. Kendra.
Yes, huge question. Absolutely huge and so important. I would say this, actually, this is what it's just preaching on yesterday. Yes, yesterday was Sunday. Woo, time warps. Right, there's one thing that I say to all of our confirmation students, so all the teenagers that come and, want to take some intensive time to study and consider their faith. If they remember nothing else, literally nothing else from that entire experience, I tell them I want them to remember that they are beloved. They are beloved. Right? This goes back to what I was saying earlier, that every person has value just by. That's how God made us, right? It's not dependent on what we do or don't do. Every person is beloved. And so instilling that worth, I think, is a really important role that churches have, to just say it again and again and again and again and again. Some good brew for the morning, maybe. Right, so I think that's just a critical message, but then how we live it out, right? We can say that, but then we have to show up, right? to show up for our youth in all the ways that it matters, to say, we are behind you, you are whole, you are growing in amazing ways. So one of the ways our congregation does this that's been exciting even in the last couple of years is extending scholarship programs for all sorts of kids. I know there's a vibrant scholarship program throughout the community. I think that's great. The school district is trying to ramp up some mental health supports. I think that's an awesome thing where we as churches could definitely continue to partner and make sure those resources are available. But it's also really just relationships, right? Showing up for our kids, all of them, and making sure that they have what they need. So, going back to the last question, this is a place where we show up as people of faith. Like, I'm convicted. Like, the reason I contact the school board is because I want them to have these resources that kids need for all sorts of challenges they're facing right from the get-go, right? Like, we need to do that as people of faith and as churches together. So not just share our money, not just support programs, but show up and advocate to make sure that not a single child falls through the crack right from day one and has everything they need to be supported. No parent should struggle. No grandparent raising a kid should struggle. Nobody should struggle. That, I hope, is something we could all definitely agree on.
This is probably the question I feel most inadequate for right now. First of all, my baby is 31 years old. And so I don't live in this world actively, but I would say that some of the things that I'm aware of in my world with first responders is how challenging life is in mental health areas and who law enforcement is dealing with, who the EMTs and paramedics are engaging with, how challenging that is. I'm aware that at United Hospital, they've cleared a floor and just made it youth mental health, that the need is that great. And I'm aware of some of this in my life. I've had both a nephew and a brother take their own life and been exposed to a number of suicides through my role as a chaplain, and I have hands-on, eyes-on understanding, not fully at all, but about how broken this world is, right? And we both share, and what we want to do is decelerate the brokenness. And a lot of what's going on is acceleration these days. And again, that's primarily, I think a lot of it's relational in its orientation. It's relationships. And so taking relationships seriously, humbly learning to listen. We're told in Scripture to be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, because the anger of man does not produce the righteous life that God wants for us. And and to take the youth seriously. Again, we're fortunate that we have programming for that at Faith Community, and yet I want to engage every kid at Culver's and McDonald's. Not that I'd eat that kind of food, mind you, but that those that are serving different things, to take them seriously, to celebrate them, to let them feel noticed in various ways. And I would really encourage, I've tried this a few times and frankly haven't succeeded yet, relationships between church, school, and government in helping struggling families to find more united ways to address that, I think could lead to something really powerful. And doing those dances has proved problematic. I'm not saying they're the problem, I'm just saying it's a challenge. And if we improved in that realm, I think that would be one step forward for us.
So I can speak to this from two angles. One is that we have a daughter who's graduating from the Hudson High School this year, and she did experience some significant mental health struggles the last few years that required her being out of our home for treatment for months at a time. And it was a very eye-opening experience for us. It created a lot of compassion, and I think for me it peeled back the layers to say, why are kids struggling so badly? Because if we can answer that, then we can appropriately apply then what should we do about it? And I think, to me, what I see is that kids are responding largely to the adult world and the adult role modeling. So the things that they see happening and the fears, the anxieties, the hatred, the relational breakdowns that young people are experiencing via parents, families, whoever the meaningful people are in their lives, it's not hard to understand why our youth are struggling. They are experiencing a direct ripple effect from us as adults. And so I think, honestly, when I think about how do we heal our youth, I actually think we heal ourselves. And I think that's a huge part of it. I think a lot of the hate and vitriol and shaking and quaking we're seeing in the world and right here on our streets of Hudson is because people are the conglomerate of the sum total of their lives, their stories, their experiences from the time they were children. And I don't think most people are super aware of what's simmering beneath the surface of their souls most days. And so it's not hard for me to understand why people are reacting so horribly to one another all day long, and then our kids watch this and go, and where's the safety? And so I think that if we really want to tend our youth, I think we would do well to begin getting underneath the layers of our own stuff and showing them what health mentally, spiritually, physically looks like. And then we can start walking them through what that looks like. My only other thought, I did serve on our mental health council here in the community for the last couple of years. I stepped down this year as I'm hitting the gas pedal to the end of seminary. And again, very eye-opening work. Again, as a parent, I think the amount of pressure that is put on kids to perform at levels that are subhuman, that is a whole nother conversation that you could have me here for an hour on. Whether it's academically, athletically, the rigors of what we call normal for teens and kids, I can't even fathom that that's what we call normal. We have literally stripped, okay, we're not even talking about human beings anymore. We've created machines. They are human doings, and these kids are doing something all hours of the day. And if they're not doing multiple things and doing them well, academically, athletically, musically, I mean, they got to be the best at everything. And they all know it. They all know it. And if you're not the best at everything, welcome to the Shark Tank, known as adolescence in a wealthy white suburban community. And they feel that. They feel that. I think we need to dismantle some of those pressure cookers that are being placed on our kids and remind them to just be human beings and stop trying to conquer the world by what they can do.
I know at the library we talk about, if you see a child in the stacks and you're busy, just try to take a second, say hello, smile, ask them about the book that they're picking out, because it's possible that could be the only positive interaction that child has that day. And so we all have the power to do that, like in the grocery store, the pharmacy, or wherever it is we are. Okay, so we're going to run just a little bit over. And while this question might seem very specific, it's actually not. It's very universal. And it is somebody who has a friend who is dying of cancer. It's not going to make it very long. And you could insert any disease in place of that. What could be said to this person to impress upon him the urgency to ask Christ into his life? So this is a lay person asking this question. And it's a tough one, too. It's Larry.
First of all, death is an enemy. It is not consistent with the world God designed. And that God's ultimate triumph in Christ is that one day the death of death will take place. That is a day I greatly look forward to. More than that, I look forward to the day when I no longer have aberrant thoughts, attitudes, selfishness, when that stripped from me, because it is just so pervasive in who I am still, and I just long for that day when that changes. What really doubles down the indignity of this all is that with COVID, people are dying alone. And I'm so grateful for the caring medical workers who will hold a hand and will take a moment to listen to someone. It is angering and abusive to not be able to do it, and yet I understand. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of thing. I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe that he has made a way for anyone. It is whether you have followed him from day one of your life, or like a thief on the cross right before his very last breath, just simply said, remember me. Lord, remember me when you enter your kingdom. And the reply of Jesus was, this day, you're going to be with me in paradise. And I am so grateful for a God whose heart is that big that in this Christmas season, he sent a son that humble and that giving, that he would say to anyone, trust me, come. I am your I'm your ultimate safety. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. And so I would encourage anyone, and I would say, even though you could be a thief on the cross, I'm so grateful at age 19 that stuff started to make sense to me. And I'm still struggling with the fallout of those years and the stupidity since then. But I'm so grateful for this thing called the grace of God. And death is an enemy, and Jesus came. The reason he rose from the dead is to be a signal of what the future is for anyone who would trust in him. And that is, following him we die, following him we rise. I will follow him.
I feel like we should say amen and just be done. Like, what am I going to say to that? I actually want to pull from the last question and marry the two together, like the struggle with youth or watching a loved one dying of cancer. To me, holding out Jesus is the same. We're trying to get at the same hole in the soul at both ends of life. And to me, you know, I hear the question was written more in a, how would we, there's urgency, we've got to get this person to pull across the line. And to me, Jesus is a beautiful enough appeal that I don't need to sell him to anyone. I simply need to tell you what he's done in my story. I simply need to share of where death came knocking on my door at different points in my life and why I chose Jesus. And so I think, you know, whether it's our youth or a loved one dying of cancer, our souls will not find rest until we find Jesus. That's a very generic paraphrase of an Augustine quote. And so I think for me, my hope is to paint Jesus in such a beautiful way that it would be really hard to say no to him. And we do want to return to the eternal good that we were created for. Like, this isn't a gimmick. Jesus isn't a gimmick. Like, we're not trying to get more Christians. We're trying to satisfy souls with the only thing we believe works. And for me and for my friends here, we would say that's Jesus. And so to me, that appeal sounds different than hurry up, I need you to pray before you take your last breath.
I'd also add, whoever asked that question, I'd be happy to chat afterwards.
Yeah, and I guess my pastor's heart just clicks in, you know, all these situations. And the one thing above all that feels important for me to affirm is that I think God's love is always bigger than we can imagine. And it's certainly part of my faith that leaning into Jesus as God's love embodied on earth helps me trust in the big story of God creating in goodness and constantly seeking out people in goodness and calling us back to love, and that Larry mentioned that God is our refuge. And so my inclination in those moments is to lean into that love and to just be present in love and not get too caught up in things that are ultimately beyond our control, right? And to trust that as we embody God's love that Jesus embodied, that God is going to hold us fast. Anytime I try to limit God, I get in trouble. Anytime I try to say God will do this and God will not do that, I'm always proven wrong. And so I think in those moments, trusting that narrative and just being that love for the person is always the way, at least I choose to go, is just embody love and presence and listening, and look for the ways to be affirming and loving to one another. The other thing that occurred to me that's related to the last question is just a plug for mental health first aid in our community. I believe if you go to the United Way website, you can still sign up. They're doing like once a month virtual trainings. A great resource. Highly recommend it for everybody, both to be present to our youth and learn some of the signals and warning signs of a significant mental health challenge, but I think it also helps reframe mental health for everyone, because we need to take away that stigma too, which goes to helping ourselves, right, as well as our youth. So that got a little bit off topic, but hopefully a decent wrap up, Shelley.
Well, these last words were all so beautiful. I'm feeling a little speechless, which you all know is kind of a miracle. So I'm just really grateful. When I reached out to you and said, will you come talk about church and Jesus and God at a bar? You were like, yeah, sure, we'll be there. And thank you very much. This has been a really thrilling aspect of this series. I've just heard so much authentic, and such a beautiful dialogue tonight. I really am genuinely grateful and thrilled that you did this. It will be kept on Facebook. The River Channel keeps it on their page. You can get to it from our page. And so please let people know about it. I think it would be a great thing to get terrible weather tonight, but people at home will watch. So please give them a big round of applause.